we're still in this major section of the exposition of the gospel. The last 2 weeks will unpack Paul's exhortations. In light of what we believe, what is the behavior we should be showing towards each others, particularly in early Christian Rome. Okay. But we're in this last section of the exposition. So remember, the table setting was, how the gospel reveals God's righteousness. That's, the gospel of Jesus Christ is what fulfills everything that God has promised. Then he unpacks it in what we have up here, section B. He unpacks how the gospel, how Jesus creates a new humanity, or God creates a new humanity in Christ and in the Spirit. Through Christ, he gives us his Spirit so that we become other Christs, okay? So we went through that really a lot. So there's kind of a continuous train of thought. This section C is also part of the exposition, but it's kind of Paul going back to a question that he gave us but didn't really explore, okay? Now, I'll warn you a little bit. This section is pretty dense, okay? And I think part of that is because, like Paul is still trying, he's still trying to work out all this stuff. I mean, not that he doesn't know what he believes, but he's just there's a mystery to it, of namely the question of what's Israel's role in all of this. It seems like they kind of got the short end of the stick. If you get to the Messiah, many of them miss the boat, and then, well, too bad, right? What's the benefit of being an Israelite or Jew? So how is it? Did God just? I mean, the question is, did God just forget about Israel and his promises to them? And this is a personal. It's a theological question for Paul. It's also a pastoral problem because in the early church, you're dealing with these Jewish and Christian communities who have some natural tension, right? It's also a personal problem for Paul. Okay, he's a Jew and he cares about his people. I think maybe to translate it into our own day, it's kind of like us and a lot of people who we struggle with, what about my family, friends, and neighbors who don't practice their faith, right? What about them? Has God abandoned them? Have they abandoned God? I mean, yes and yes, maybe, right? It's not just and when people especially ask me as a priest, about their family and friends who don't practice faith, it's not just a theological problem. It is, right? But it's also a personal problem. It's and I think just to kind of, that's how Paul feels about this question. That's part of why he's going back to it. But it does fit within God's whole plan with these first two sections. Okay, this is not simply an aside. It fits in with the whole thing because God's fulfillment to the promises of Israel is part of that's the whole thing of what God's been doing this whole time, right? Jesus didn't come out of a vacuum. He came as the Jewish Messiah to fulfill God's promises to the Jews. So Paul is also showing that to us, okay? It's not just I'm going to deal with this Jewish question. It's no, it also fits into really the whole scope. One of the things, and I remember I didn't really appreciate this until we studied Paul in seminary, because for us, it's okay, the Jew-Gentile question, what's the big deal? Well, part of the big deal is that the Jewish Messiah was supposed to save the nations as the nations, not as Jews. It was the Jews, yes, but also the Gentiles as Gentiles. Okay, and we've talked about that. But so Paul is at pains here and throughout the rest of his letters to show, how is God saving not just the Jews, but the Gentiles as Gentiles? Because if he's just saving the Jews or just saving the Gentiles, well, then he's not really the promised Messiah. Okay. So anyway, yeah. So there's theological, pastoral, and personal things going on here. So what he's going to do in 9, 10, and 11, more or less, it doesn't quite correspond this way, 9, 10, 11, but he's going to look at the past history of Israel, the present rejection of some, and he's going to look towards the future. What's the future? Okay, and it roughly corresponds to 9, 10, and 11, more or less. Okay, so first he's going to look at the past. Okay, so if we go in now to chapter 9, verse 1, I am speaking the truth in Christ. I am not lying. My conscience bears me witness in the Holy Spirit that I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. What is he anguishing over? Well, he's going to tell us in a second, but he's anguishing over the fact that his Israelite brothers and sisters many of them have rejected the Messiah. And he's using language here as like an oath language, possibly just to convey to the people that, like, yeah, my ministry to the Gentiles is not at all a rejection or that I don't care about the Jews, okay, or the Israelites. I absolutely care, and it pains me that my own people, many of them aren't getting on board with Jesus and believing that he's the Messiah, okay? He's trying to really emphasize that point. There's also an echo here of him being like Moses. Moses interceded for the Israelites who were not faithful in the golden calf. God was said, I just want to start over, right? I'll start over with you, Moses. And Moses is like, but remember your covenant to them, right? And there's anguish for Moses, right? So Paul's kind of playing a Mosaic role here. For I could wish that I myself were accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brethren, my kinsmen according to the flesh. I think what he's saying, using a little hyperbole here, that like if I thought it was helpful for me to be cut off from Christ, that would lead to their conversion, I would do it. Okay, which is the highest thing for Paul. Now he's using a little bit of exaggeration. Obviously, he knows that that's not good, but he's saying, if I could take their alienation upon myself from Christ and that was actually going to be helpful, I would do it. Okay, that's how much I care about them. Verse 4, they are Israelites, and to them belong the sonship, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, and the promises. To them belong the patriarchs, and of their race, according to the flesh, is the Christ, who is God over all, blessed forever. Amen. So, one thing that and this is important for this section 9 through 11, if you notice, Paul he doesn't say to the Jews belongs all these things. He says to the Israelites, okay? And he's going to, mostly in 1 through 8, he was talking specifically about, when he mentions the Jews, he's talking about the Jews, okay? But in 9 through 11, he's broadening his scope, and he's talking about Israel, okay? And that's important for kind of how we figure out exactly what he's getting at in this section. And just to kind of, review, or just to, remember that the Israelites were descendants of Jacob, okay, who was renamed Israel, hence Israelites. And that included the 12 tribes, okay? That was how they organized themselves, is into 12 tribes, okay? One of those tribes was the tribe of Judah. And that's where we get the term Jews. Glossing over a lot of Old Testament history, okay, after the northern kingdom was exiled and the southern kingdom was exiled, there was a remnant that came back, okay, to try to rebuild Jerusalem. And from then, once the remnant came back, they were all mostly from the tribe of Judah, so they called themselves Jews, okay. There was also some of the tribe of Levi mixed in there, and some of the tribe of Benjamin. But for the most part, they were all from the tribe of Judah. So starting around 500 BC, give or take, okay, they referred to themselves as Jews, okay. However, to be a Jew is also to be an Israelite. Not all Israelites are Jews, but all Jews are Israelites. And in the time of Jesus and Paul, the only people essentially left in the Holy Land were the tribe of Judah. All of the other tribes, 10 tribes, and then you got Judah and Benjamin, but very much a minority, okay, was left. But you've got the lost 10 tribes. When they were exiled, they were scattered among the nations, never to return, okay? So, to this point, Paul has been talking about, up from 1 through 8, Paul's been talking about the Jews. Why? Because he's dealing with Jewish Christians in Rome, and we've kind of been unpacking all that. But here he's broadening the scope, because God's promises were not to the Jews, but to Israel. The Jews were the faithful remnant that hung around, and that's not insignificant. But, part of what Paul's saying is, maybe one way to put it is, Paul's not content to go after the little fish of how is God going to save the Jews. He's going after the big fish of how does God fulfill his promises to Israel? Because, those 10 tribes have been scattered and long gone a long time ago. Okay. And hopefully by the end of tonight, you'll see how Paul's kind of clever kind of solution to that. Okay. So, but anyway, he's going to use the term Israel and Israelites. So he's thinking about all the people who are descended from Jacob, not just the Jews, even though that certainly includes the Jews. Okay. The people of the tribe of Judah. And by the way, just in case you forgot, Jesus is from the tribe of Judah. Okay. And so is David, right? Okay. And so back to in 4 and 5, we're talking about, the question, right, is like, what's the advantage of being an Israelite? Well, many things, right? Paul lists all kinds of things, the sonship, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, worship. These were all good things that brought them closer to God, okay? And most of all, according to the flesh, the Christ. Christ is a descendant, is an Israelite, and he is a Jew. And that's not insignificant. That from them comes the greatest blessing, okay? So again, the question is, how does God fulfill his promises to all of scattered Israel? And all of these blessings and all these promises, this is very far from nothing. These are great advantages brought about to God's people throughout the Old Testament and even into Paul's time, right? So, to verse 6, but it is not as though the word of God had failed. If you want to look, this is kind of if you want to look at a thesis statement of Paul, this is kind of his thesis for 9 to 11, right? The question of, did God fail in his promises to Israel? And Paul's saying here in verse 6, no, God did not fail in his promises, okay? And then he's going to walk us through that, the rest of it. For not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel, and not all are children of Abraham because they are his descendants, but through Isaac shall your descendants be named. So what Paul's going to do here is he's making the point that ever since Abraham, there's always been a subset or a remnant or a chosen section of the people who are called and chosen by God and faithful. Okay, God made all these promises to Abraham, but not all the promises of Abraham were extended to all his descendants. Okay, a lot of people don't know this, but so Abraham had a slave son by a slave girl, Hagar. He had Ishmael, okay, and that was not the son of the promise. The son of the promise was Isaac. Abraham also, though, later, a lot of people don't know this, he also married a woman after Sarah died and was blessed with 6 more sons after. So, he was fertile late in life, and so anyway, so he actually had 8 sons in total with 3 different women. But there was only one who received the promises, right? Through God's election, right? And that's Isaac, okay? So again, Paul's point here is just because you're descended from Abraham doesn't mean that you received the promises. It was passed on through Isaac specifically, okay? So again, ethnicity, it's not nothing, but it's not as essential as what some of the Jews are thinking, right? Okay. And then, let's keep going. Here, I guess I just said that. Yeah, so Isaac was chosen over Ishmael, and then the later sons that Abraham had, okay? Verse 8, this means that it is not the children of the flesh who are the children of God, but the children of the promise are reckoned as descendants, okay? So it's not just about ethnicity, it's about who God gives his promises, okay? For this is what the promise said. About this time I will return, and Sarah shall have a son. Again, part of the fault of Abraham and Sarah was they tried to take matters into their own hands when Sarah's like, you know what, I'm not going to have any kids. And this was a common accepted practice at the time. The story I'm sure you're familiar with, where she said, here, take my slave girl, have a child through her, and then legally it would be Sarah's. But God's like, that's not what I promised, right? I promised that it would come through you and Sarah, right? And eventually it does, but Sarah and Abraham's kind of lack of trust in God does cause tension in their family later on, right, between Isaac and Ishmael. But the whole point, Paul's point here, is the promises, God's promises, came through Isaac, and that's very clear based on his citation of Genesis here and through the Genesis story. Okay, verse 10, and not only so, meaning not only Isaac, but also when Rebekah, Isaac's wife, had conceived children by one man, our forefather Isaac, though they were not yet born and had done nothing either good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of his call, she was told, the elder will serve the younger. This is, again, so continuing down the family tree, we got Abraham, Isaac, okay? Isaac's wife, Rebekah, is pregnant with twins, and Paul's point here is they hadn't done anything yet. They weren't born yet. They did nothing praiseworthy or blameworthy. And God tells Rebekah, the elder shall serve the younger, meaning God had chosen Jacob over Esau. What's Paul's point? It's not ethnicity that really matters. It's God's choice and God's election, okay, that matters. As it is written, verse 13, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. Now this sounds a little rough to us, okay? It's a citation from Malachi, and it's Esau I hated is a Semitic expression, meaning that God loved Esau less than Jacob, or he favored Esau less than Jacob, okay? It does not mean that God is predestining Esau for damnation or punishment even, okay? It's God. It's a Semitic expression. I'll give you a similar in the gospel, right? Jesus says, whoever does not hate his father and mother for my sake is not worthy of me. Okay. Now, does Jesus desire that we hate in the sense of like try to backstab and undermine our father and mother? No. Okay. He's using a similar expression, a Semitic expression, to say your parents are not as important as me because I'm God. Right? So again, while it sounds weird to us, what God's saying here in the prophet Malachi and what Paul is quoting is essentially God favored Jacob. He chose Jacob. Okay, that's the point here. All right. Oops, this is upside down. On a larger scale, okay, meaning not just Jacob and Esau, but they also come to represent their peoples. The Israelites descended from Jacob. Does anybody know what the people called who descended from Esau? It was like a Bible trivia question. The Edomites. Edom. E-D-O-M. So you got Isaac, and this is Jacob, right? And then you've got the Edomites, or Edom. And they were neighbors of Israel, okay? And God, and it is true that the Edomites were not the chosen people, okay? But there are passages in the Old Testament where God shows concern for the Edomites, okay? It's not that God damns them to hell, but he elected Israel, the descendants of Jacob, okay? What's the point? What's Paul's point? Israel's election springs from God's divine love. If you want another way to think of it, if you want to quote Jesus, right? It's not you who chose me, but I who chose you. And God has made these choices. I mean, I could draw up, Abraham's up there, right? God has made these choices even through the patriarchs. It's his election that matters, not I am physically descended from Abraham, okay? Verse 14, what shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? Again, kind of like the whiny teenager. This doesn't sound fair, Esau got the short end of the stick, right? Well, I don't know. This has been brought up a few times, right? And Paul says, by no means, okay? God is not unjust. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. Okay. Now, what's Paul quoting here? What's Paul defending? Okay. Paul is defending God's freedom to be merciful and generous as God sees fit. Okay. Again, to quote Jesus in the New Testament, wherever it is, are you envious because I am generous? Right. One of Jesus' parables, right? One of the landlords says, are you envious because I'm generous? Right? It's like God is free to be generous as he so chooses, right? We're talking about everybody's fallen away. God is choosing, to be generous to the chosen people. And eventually what Paul will show us is it's also for everybody, right? It's not just that God is only saving Israel. It's for the sake of the rest, okay? And the context of Paul is quoting Exodus, okay? Notice how Paul is giving us a very kind of quick overview of the story that they would have all been familiar with. We've talked about quickly here, Genesis. Now we've moved to Exodus, right? The first two books of the Bible. Okay, the passage that Paul's quoting is when God chooses to have mercy after the golden calf debacle. Okay, so God is saying, I'll have mercy. I'm going to have mercy on them this time. I'm going to have compassion. Okay, again, God's election, right? And God has the freedom to do that. The whole point is Israel's election depends on God's choice and his mercy. God could have said and been completely just, you know what? You guys went for the golden calf, have it your way, right? The Burger King slogan, right? BK, have it your way, But he doesn't. He's merciful. He chooses them, okay? 16. So it depends not upon man's will or exertion, but upon God's mercy. Again, it is not you who chose me, but I who chose you. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, I have raised you up for the very purpose of showing my power in you, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. So he has mercy upon whomever he wills, and he hardens the heart of whoever he wills. Now again, this might sound a little unfair to us, okay? But what God is, when the Bible says God is hardening Pharaoh's heart, it's not that God is thwarting Pharaoh's free will. It's that God uses Pharaoh to glorify God in a different way. He allows Pharaoh's stubbornness of heart to become encrusted and solid and immovable, and then God crushes that and Pharaoh's gods to show I'm greater than Pharaoh and his gods, okay? It's, again, remember, one of God's worst punishments is to let the sinner continue on his way. Say, okay, have it your way, Pharaoh. And we know from the Exodus story that, Pharaoh had turned against God and was obstinate, right? He saw God's power and said, nope, I'm not going to let him go, right? And so God says, okay, I'm going to let you go the way you're choosing, and then I'm going to show you that I'm actually boss above you and your gods, that they're nothing in comparison to me. And a lot of the plagues are specifically really, direct insults to the gods of Egypt, okay? They worship the sun. Well, we're going to have darkness come over the earth, and it's going to be, they worshipped Pharaoh, the firstborn, as and Pharaoh particularly as a god. Well, who's more powerful, right? So now, again, Paul's kind of making the point here, again, that God uses mercy and compassion to show his glory in the case of Israel. He uses his justice in the case of Pharaoh, right? And God is free to do that, okay? And it's not unfair in the sense of God is he is working both through the Israelites and through Pharaoh to bring about his purposes, okay? And by the way, it doesn't look good for Pharaoh, admittedly, but there are times where hardening of heart does not necessarily mean beyond hope, okay? That doesn't look good, right? But it doesn't, again, God can use both for his purposes. He's the one orchestrating this story so that it works out according to his divine plan, okay? A lot of this, and we've talked about this, and it is a mystery, okay? The relationship between divine sovereignty, I'm probably going to misspell this. That's close enough. Versus human free will, okay? God's will, God's divine sovereignty is never thwarted. Yet we are also free. We hold to both of those two things, okay? In other words, God can act in and through and with human freedom and still be absolutely powerful, okay? Now, like, how does this work? Well, the problem is for us to comprehend that, we would have to be a being that is absolutely sovereign, like God, and we're not, okay? If I want to force you to do something against your will, I have to force you from the outside. But because God is the precondition of freedom itself, it's not just, another way to say it is, it's not just that God has freedom, like he went to the divine supermarket and said, I'm going to be a God that has freedom, okay? God is freedom itself. His power is, by definition, not thwartable. You can't oppose, God is, that's what it means to say God is omnipotent. Yet he does will that things come about by human free causes. And he can work in and through them without violating our free will. Okay? He can influence us from the inside, as it were, without compromising our freedom. So, in the case of Pharaoh, right, to go back to Pharaoh freely chose to oppose God, and God used that to show his glory. Israel freely chose to go against God with the golden calf, and God used them to show his glory through his mercy and compassion, right? And God is the one who is orchestrating all of these things that we can't understand fully in principle, okay? Because we're not the conductor, right? Paul, well, okay, let's keep going because Paul's going to make this point, okay? Basically, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, okay? Verse 19, okay? You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? Again, okay? This doesn't sound fair, right? God wins every time, so I'm not really free, right? Is what it sounds like. So yeah, like I said, sometimes I get ahead of myself, or ahead of Paul. Verse 20, but who are you, a man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to the molder, why have you made me thus? Okay. Here's one thing, this is a clever point that C.S. Lewis points out. One of the problems of arguing against God is that you're arguing against the one who gives you the very power to argue, okay? It would kind of be like, I don't know, what's a good example? I'm trying to think, what's the example that he gives, you know? Well, I can't remember the example that Lewis gives off the top of my head, but I mean, the example Paul gives, right, is, does the clay say to the potter, why did you make me thus? You know, and this is a very rich Old Testament image, okay? The potter and the clay and the potter are not on the same ontological level, okay? Like, you know, I mean, first of all, part of the ridiculousness of that is the clay can't in principle understand what the potter is doing with it. Similarly, we can't understand in principle the totality of what God is doing, right? So if he makes us a vessel for one thing or a vessel for another, like, there's a certain point where we have to step back and say, you know, God, you're God and I'm not, okay? The other thing that is being very much echoed here is Job, okay? We have this whole story in Job of how Satan goes to God and says, hey, you know, does Job really love you? Like, if you take everything away from him, he'll curse you. And God says, okay, do it, right? Just don't kill him. And, you know, he goes through all this stuff, right? And Job knows he's righteous. And we know Job is righteous. And Job gets to a point where he says, you know, God, you need to explain yourself to me, right? And what does God do? Explain himself? No. Basically, God says to Job, you can, you know, have you ran this whole operation for a day, right? Do you know how to cause the sun to rise, or he takes him on a virtual tour of the cosmos and shows how Job has absolutely things that he sees every day. He has absolutely no idea how they actually come together in principle. And God says, you need to remember, I'm God, you're not. Right? And so, and part of it, okay, why is if God was to answer Job's question, would that really give Job comprehension? No, it would only lead to more questions, which would lead to more questions, right? God, it's not basically God's answer to Job is, I'm God, you're not. Okay, like you're the clay, I'm the potter. I can't explain to you in principle such that you can comprehend all the things that I am interacting with dynamically. Okay, and that's kind of Paul's point here, right? Will the molded say to its molder, why have you made me thus? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for beauty and another one for menial use? What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience the vessels of wrath made for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory for the vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand for glory? Suffice it, here, let me finish. Even us whom he has called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. Again, if God wants to use Pharaoh to show his glory in one way and Israel in a different way, who's to say, right? Like, God, you're not fair. Well, you're arguing with the very one who is justice itself, and he's operating on a level that, again, we can't comprehend. That doesn't mean that it's unreasonable to say that God is absolutely sovereign and we have free will. It's just we're never going to be able to fully, like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense, and there's no more questions to ask. There's always going to be more questions with God. I'm God, you're not. Okay. Let's see. Is there anything else I want to say about that? Yeah, and I think, again, just both. It's the classic Catholic both and. Okay. God is both absolutely sovereign and we are free. And sometimes you can get into anthropological, theological errors because it's a lot easier to just say God's absolutely powerful, and then you're a determinist or predestination, right? Double predestination. I have no say in the matter. Or we're completely free and we can go against God, right? Maybe like Pelagianism or something, right? I can save myself, right? Or something like that. Okay. It's a lot easier the errors are on the extremes, right? Because it's a lot easier for us to wrap our minds around that, but that's not where the truth is. Okay, it's a both and. Okay. So now we get to Hosea. Okay. As indeed he says in Hosea, those who are not my people, I will call my people, and her who is not beloved, I will call my beloved. And in the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people, they will be called sons of the living God. So now this is where Paul talking about Israel and not just the Jews starts to become significant, because the prophecy that Paul is referring to in Hosea is God is in particularly talking about the Israelites who were exiled, scattered among the nations, and are now part of the lost 10 tribes. They are not my people, but I'm going to bring them. So the prophecy that Paul's citing, and this is something that I think is probably lost on us on first reading, but I don't think it would have necessarily been by his first readers. He's actually not talking about the Gentiles per se. He's talking about the lost tribes who are intermixed with the Gentiles. Okay. We'll get to why I think that's significant. Okay. And Isaiah cries out concerning Israel. By the way, I should mention, Paul has more Old Testament citations in this section, 9 through 11, than any other section of Romans. So just kind of, he's, in a way, Paul is, to grapple with this question that's so important to him, the question of God's promises to Israel, he is reading the Old Testament. Like, how do I read the Old Testament to answer this question, essentially? Okay. And Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the sons of Israel be as the sand of the sea, only a remnant of them will be saved. For the Lord will execute his sentence upon the earth with rigor and dispatch. And as Isaiah predicted, If the Lord of hosts had not left us children, we would have fared like Sodom and been made like Gomorrah. Okay, so in these two passages in Isaiah, the first part is talking about how, okay, the northern kingdom was exiled and left, okay, and was scattered and lost. Okay, here I'll put lost just so we can remember the lost 10 tribes. Ever heard of that before? The lost 10, yeah, that's what it's referring to, okay? Because once the northern kingdom was exiled, they were gone, okay? They to the point where they weren't even ethnically identifiable anymore. Right, and this is what is important here, okay? And then so that first one is talking about how, like, the remnant, again, through God's election, was the Jews, right, and Ben, right, the minority, okay, the two tribes. And then that last one, in verse 29 there, if the Lord of hosts had not left us children, we would have fared like Sodom, and Sodom and Gomorrah is code for the worst you could think of. Okay, the most faithless people you could think of. What's the point here? It's because of God's election that we, the faithful remnant, are still faithful. Okay, not because of our doing, but because of His doing. Again, because of His choice, because of His mercy, because of His love. Otherwise, we would have been like the lost 10 tribes, is what Isaiah is referring to in this prophecy. Okay. All right, so continuing the next section, verse 30. What shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it, that is, righteousness through faith, but that Israel, who pursued the righteousness which is based on the law, did not succeed in fulfilling the law. So now Paul he's already kind of given us a little history of Israel's rejection of God in the past and how there has been this faithful remnant, okay? Now he's kind of moving to the present, okay? Now in the current situation of, how does it seem fair that those who were part of Israel now are rejecting the Messiah, right? That's the whole question. In other words, do the Gentiles get a free pass? Okay, that they just went along for all these years, and now they're getting saved. Okay. Verse 32. Why? Because they did not pursue it through faith. Oh, okay. Well, essentially, before we get to that, the answer is no. Right? The Gentiles aren't getting a free pass. Okay. Why? But why is it? But Israel, who pursued the righteousness which is based on the law, did not succeed in... Oh, sorry, I didn't read verse 31. Verse 31. But that Israel, who pursued the righteousness which is based on the law, did not succeed in fulfilling the law. Why? Because they did not pursue it through faith, but as if it were based on works. So what's Paul saying? Yeah, Israel pursued the right thing, righteousness, but not the right way. They didn't pursue it through faith, but as if the works of the law are what justified them. And that's where their error was. It's true, the Gentiles didn't even pursue righteousness. But just because you pursue the right goal doesn't mean you go about it the right way. Okay. The ends don't justify the means. Okay. And if you take the wrong means, that could lead you astray. Just because I don't know. Maybe I want to go to the right destination. I want to go to wherever, I want to go to, I'm going to Bozeman, and I want to go to Bozeman, right? Because that's where I need to be. But I do it by going 150 miles an hour, right? Like, well, okay, I had the right idea of where I was headed, but I didn't do it the right way. Okay. Maybe you didn't even bother going, right? You're just like, oh, I'm just going to stay here, But like that's kind of what he's saying there, right? That's his criticism, right? Israel, they didn't pursue it through faith. Okay, they have stumbled over the stumbling stone, as it is written, "Behold, I am laying in Zion a stone that will make men stumble, a rock that will make them fall, and he who believes in him will not be put to shame." If you can't tell here, and it's also all over the Old Testament, this idea of the stone, right, is code for or a symbol of the Messiah. And there is this idea in the Old Testament that the Messiah, think about what a stone is, right? It's a foundation, or you've heard many times, the stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, right? A stone is something, or a rock is something that gives solidity and foundation and stability, right? And for some, it is that, right? You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, right? That kind of idea. But a stone can also be a stumbling block. It can make you trip. Okay? And there's this kind of, again, this thread throughout the Old Testament that the stone, which the builders rejected, also it makes some people, while it's saving for some, it makes others stumble. Okay, so Paul is saying, like, we shouldn't be that surprised that the Messiah is a stumbling block for some, because that's been predicted this whole time. Okay, so now we're on to chapter 10. This is kind of the same section, though. Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. Again, Paul reiterating that, he does want his people to be saved. I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but it is not enlightened. Again, he credits them. The problem with Israel was never their not wanting to or indifference. Okay, they particularly glorified zeal. Some of the greatest heroes of the Old Testament for Israel are those who had zeal, those who were on fire for God. However, okay, misplaced zeal is not an excuse. Okay, you can have, and even today in the church, right? Just because you have zeal doesn't mean whatever you think you should do means you're justified. Okay, so it wasn't indifference. I think today, right, like that maybe our problem would be more indifference. That was not the problem in Jesus's day. Okay, the Jews were very zealous, so much so that Jesus, when they rejected him, was seen as a threat. So they were willing to give him the ultimate punishment, right? So Paul gives them credit for that, but it is not enlightened, meaning it's misplaced zeal. They missed the Messiah. Okay. And also too, by the way, Paul had personal experience with misplaced zeal. Okay, what did he do when this Christian movement cropped up? He was more zealous than anybody, and he was pursuing them in Damascus to round them up, right? Paul was a zealous man, right? And so he's not just speaking of like, oh, those guys over there. He's like, that was me, right? I had misplaced zeal. Now he has, because he literally was knocked off his horse through light, the light of Christ, he has enlightened zeal. Now he's, going to the ends of the world to proclaim the gospel to the Gentiles, okay? Verse 3, for being ignorant of the righteousness that comes from God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. For Christ is the end of the law, that everyone who has faith may be justified. Notice there in verse 3, the sin of the Jews ends up being just like that of Pharaoh, right? They don't submit to God's righteousness, right? Stubbornness of heart. And then in verse 4 there, when he says Christ is the end of the law, what does he mean by end? Goal, or like end zone, right? The place we're trying to get, meaning the law, the whole point of the law was to point to the goal of the law was to point to the Christ, which means Messiah in Greek, okay? The law was not an end in itself. It was to bring us to Christ. And so by missing Christ, they miss the point of the law. Okay. All right, verse 5. Moses writes that the man who practices the righteousness which is based on the law shall live by it. But the righteousness based on faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who will descend into the abyss, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. Again, this is it's a little dense here, and it's a little bit hard to parse out exactly what he's saying, but I think the gist of what he's saying here is you can't justify yourselves through practice of the law, right? You can't bring Christ down, make him come, or raise him up for the dead, right? It's through, again, what is it? What's the whole point? God's election, God's promise, God's choice, okay? But what does it say? The word is near you, on your lips and in your heart. That is the word of faith which we preach. Because if you confess with your lips that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Again, what's this whole theme of Paul that we've been seeing this whole time? It's not through works of the law that you're justified. It's through faith in Jesus Christ, okay? This verse is famous and, is oft quoted particularly by our Protestant brothers and sisters as kind of a proof text that, like, You can be in a grocery store, and if you accept Jesus into your heart, then you're saved. Poof, right? Now, can God work through experiences like that? Absolutely. Okay, but that would be I would say a reductionist reading of or interpretation of this verse. Okay, part of the whole point of him mentioning lips and heart is it's got to be not only outward but also inward, and you need both. What you profess with your lips also has to be believed in your heart. Okay, and it's not just once saved, always saved. And hopefully we can see in the context of Romans, especially in some of these passages that we talked in 1-4, that like how you respond to this free gift matters, right? And that's part of the heart. And it also affects your actions, right? Your outward, what you do with your lips, okay? So in other words, lip service is not enough. It's not enough just to say, Lord, Lord, I believe in you. You need to believe it with your heart, and that will be shown through your life, right? As St. James put it, right? You show me your faith without works, and I will demonstrate my faith to you through my works. I don't think Paul and James shouldn't be read as against each other, okay? There is very much a way in which they can be read in continuity, even if they're emphasizing different things, okay? All right, let's see, where am I at? Okay, let's keep going. For man believes with his For man believes with his heart, and so is justified, and he confesses with his lips, and so is saved. Again, this both inward and outward. The scripture says, no one who believes in him will be put to shame. He's quoting, this is a quote from Isaiah again. He's quoting a lot of Isaiah. and he already quoted, notice, he already quoted that very verse in 9:33. Okay. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek. The same Lord is Lord of all and bestows his riches upon all who call upon him. For everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. Again, bringing up a theme again that we've been talking about this whole time, that like what justifies faith in Christ. Okay. All right, moving on to 14. But how are men to call upon him? Let me see. Sorry, my thing got printed backwards. But how are men to call upon him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without a preacher? And how can men preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach good news. There's probably more we could say here, but I think with these collection of sayings, it made me think of like the good news. The gospel is the impetus behind the church's missionary spirit, right? It's like we want the good news of Jesus Christ, that we're justified through faith in him, to be spread to all the nations. And so sitting on our couches isn't going to get that done, right? And Paul, first and foremost, is the greatest example of a missionary, right? Who goes through all kinds of dangers, right? That he didn't sit around and just enjoy basking. It's like he went out to preach the gospel, even at the cost of his life. And the church's missionary spirit is always part of her commission, right? Go out to all the world and tell the good news. This verse here, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach good news. Think about it. Part of what this is from Isaiah as well. In ancient times, right? How did you learn about the news? It wasn't through your phone, right? It was through a messenger. So you see a messenger coming, and it's like how beautiful the feet, meaning the messenger is bringing good news that we have a victory, right? Because maybe you're in the city and you're like, did we win or not? And it's really scary, right? I mean, even in the Greek world, right? Like why is a marathon 26.2 miles or whatever it is? Because the messenger brought good news of the victory. It's that verse has a lot of rich connotations there. Well, now think about that in the mode of Christ becoming man, right? Or in the thought, Christ takes on flesh. How beautiful are the feet that brings good news, right? Christ is the messenger who his feet bring us good news, right? So there's a lot there too. Verse 16, but they have not all heeded the gospel. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? So faith, in other words, not just because you preach the gospel doesn't mean everybody's going to believe you, okay? And this is clear in Isaiah, and it's clear in the history of the Old Testament story. So faith comes from what is heard, and what is heard comes by the preaching of Christ. It's interesting there that he says preaching of Christ, even though, I mean, yes, Christ preached, obviously, during 3 years, 3 years and change. But what has most of the preaching been done by? His disciples, right? Us. When they hear you, they hear me, right? Jesus is not petty or like, a micromanager in the sense of like, it has to be me. No, he wants to use us, use you, to work through you, right? And it is really him and really you. It's not that, we do anything apart from him. But 18, but I ask, have they not heard? And I think here he's specifically, again, has Israel not heard? I mean, didn't Jesus himself preach to the Jews in Jerusalem and stuff? Indeed they have, for their voice has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. Again, I ask, did Israel not understand? Again, they've got the gospel preached to them. What happened? First, Moses says, I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation. With a foolish nation, I will make you angry. Again, Paul here is using the history of Israel to show how Israel rebelled against God multiple times. So it shouldn't be like this whole question of why are people rejecting the Messiah? It shouldn't be totally shocking that it's happening again. Okay, like it's happened in the past and it's happening again. Then Isaiah is so bold to say, I have been found by those who did not seek me. I have shown myself to those who did not ask for me. But of Israel, he says, all day long I have held out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people. And that's really like a twist and knife in it, right? He says on one hand, the Gentiles, right? They're the ones that have found me, and you guys that I've been with this whole time, you rejected me, right? That's probably one of Paul's most his most dagger, moment towards the Jews, but not because he doesn't care about them. Okay. All right. So we're still kind of, what's Paul's outlook? Okay. Well, now we're going to get to the future. Okay. Then chapter 11. So we've kind of talked about it. We've talked about the past, the remnant, right? There have been, God's election, the rejection of God. We talked about the present, how it's not surprising that God's people are rejecting him. It's happened in the past. It's happening again. Now Paul's going to kind of look towards the future. And again, this is pretty dense, and it's a little murky as far as what exactly Paul is thinking of. I would say in this last chapter, there's kind of 3 main points, all right, that he's going to make. His first point that he's going to make is essentially there are Jews and people of Israel who have accepted the Messiah, namely Paul and pretty much all of the early Christians. So it's not totally in vain, okay? Yes, there were many Israelites and Jews who rejected God, but that would ignore the apostles and Paul and Mary and the women of Jerusalem, right? So there are plenty, and we have this precedent of the faithful remnant. So it was fulfilled, okay? So it's not totally for naught. And then he'll make this point, and again, I think it's kind of Paul trying to work this out as far as what's the mystery of what God's doing. He'll make the point here that God is using the rejection of the Jews to benefit the Gentiles. Okay, why? Because and Paul had this from his own experience. When he got rejected by the synagogues, where was the next place that he went? To go preach to the Gentiles. So God is using the evil of the Jews' rejection for good. Not because God wills that they reject him, but God can turn bad things into good things. And he's actually using their rejection for the benefit of the Gentiles. Okay, why? Because God can bring good out of evil. He's also using the Jews as a negative example for the Gentiles. Don't be like this. Okay, that's another point he's going to make. We'll see that. And then the last point he's going to make in this chapter, this section, is about looking to the future of what God's doing. Is at the end, we'll see this, Paul still has great hope that Israel will be fully reconciled to God through Jesus. Okay. Though, again, because it's happening, but also in the future, it's a little murky as far as what exactly does he mean. Okay. But Paul hasn't given up on Israel at large. Okay. So we'll try to walk through it. Again, this whole section is a little dense, but I think, again, part of that is because Paul's trying to kind of figure this all out himself, right? What is God doing? Okay. I ask then, has God rejected his people? Remember the, really pointed remark he just said. By no means. I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin, meaning myself and people like me are Jews who have accepted the Messiah. Okay. So it's not like we all rejected him. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah, how he pleads with God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But God's reply to him, well, what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So Paul references this story where Elijah has defeated the prophets of Baal, and he's running away from the evil Queen Jezebel, one of the most evil women figures, period, in the Bible. Okay, and Elijah, from his perspective, he's like, Lord, I'm the only one left, right? Israel has totally rejected you. Now, maybe he was being a little dramatic. I mean, he was having a rough time, right? But God says, actually, Elijah, like, there's 7,000 guys who are still faithful to me, right? You couldn't see that, right? But so what's Paul's point? Just because things look bleak, okay? And by the way, Elijah's the greatest prophet, right, in the Old Testament. But he got to this point where he's like, Lord, I'm the only one left, right? Like, there's nobody else. And God's like, actually, like, I've been working behind the scenes in ways that you haven't figured out, right? And it's, so what's Paul's point, right? Okay, just because things don't look good, because a lot of Jews have rejected Jesus as the Messiah, doesn't mean that God's still not working or that there aren't faithful people. Okay, by the way, that should give us some hope too, right? Again, think about this maybe translated into our own time. For our family and friends, people we care about, like how Paul cares about his people, who outwardly reject the gospel and maybe even are living lives that are not good, that we don't give up hope on them, and that God can work in ways. If God can save 7,000, or if God can save 7,000 people during Elijah's time, and Elijah, the greatest prophet of all time, is not aware of it, he can work behind the scenes in our lives too, okay, in ways that we're not aware, right? I guess that would be the point. So verse 5, so too at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace. Okay, so just as how God was choosing and preserving those faithful people in Elijah's time, so too he's doing so now. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. Again, reiterating this point, it's about God's free choice of love for his people. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it sought. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that should not see, and ears that should not hear, down to this very day. And David says, let their feast become a snare and a trap, a pitfall and a retribution for them, lest their eyes be darkened so they cannot see and bend their backs forever. Let's see, what did I say? This is Paul's quoting Moses and David, which is foretelling Israel's hardness of heart. So again, this is not totally unexpected, is Paul's point. Okay. Verse 11, so I ask, have they stumbled so as to fall? By no means. Notice, and I haven't pointed this out yet, notice that stumbling is not the same as falling. Okay. You can stumble, but that doesn't mean you're dead in the water. Okay. It's not good, right? But Paul is, if we're using this image, and Paul, does often, of like a race, if you're watching the Olympics, right? Somebody stumbles, that doesn't mean they're out of the race. It just means, they stumbled. Now that's not good, okay? But have they stumbled so as to fall? Are they done, the Israelites? No, by no means. But through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. God is turning the rejection of Israel into a grace for the Gentiles. And Paul's kind of working this out. He's like, and then Israel is going to kind of see how, like, wow, the Gentiles have been given, right? So then they're going to be brought back, right? And like, God is working through all this, okay? Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion be? In other words, like, God can bring good out of evil. How much more greater is it going to be when he brings them back? It's going to be even more of a blessing, right? I think the key here, right? Paul is very confident in God that God will work it out. And again, if we want to, bring it back to our own day, okay, we should be very confident in God that God will work it out with ourselves, with our family and friends, okay? And that does not mean head in the sand or pretending like people who do bad things are doing good things, or that those of our family and friends who don't practice the faith, like, oh, it doesn't matter, that's not that, right? It's confidence in God that God knows what he's doing, okay? Or even if you want to look at it on the scale of the world, right, and the news that we have all the time, right? Having confidence that God knows what he's doing with the world, right? And letting it do what it's doing. That doesn't mean that we're pretending we're Pollyannish and pretend like everything's all fine when it's not, but it's that we have a more fundamental confidence that God is in control and he knows what he's doing with the world, with us, with our family and friends, okay? All right, now Paul is going to pivot here, all right? He's going to speak directly to the Roman Gentiles who are the recipients of this letter. Now I am speaking to you Gentiles. Inasmuch as as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them. Okay, Paul sees himself as an instrument of this whole kind of paradox that God is, in a good way, like kind of playing them off against the other, right? Like, wow, look at how, the Gentiles have come to the Messiah. We want that too, right? And Paul's like, but he's going to warn them here, okay? For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? Again, if God can turn their rejection into a blessing, how much greater is it going to be when they accept him, okay? If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole batch. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. The first fruits is Israel, because they're the first fruits. They're the first ones that God chose. They are the roots. The Gentiles are the branches. Their faith rests on what has come before with the Jews. Okay, and now he's going to go on this very rich Old Testament image of the olive tree. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, a wild olive shoot, were grafted in their place to share the richness of the olive tree, do not boast over the branches. So he's using this image of, and this is a practice that they did in the time, I guess still do, right? Of you could take a wild branch and graft it onto a domesticated olive tree, and that was how they would reinvigorate trees that had grown old, right, or weren't producing as much fruit. And so the branches that have been cut off are the Israelites who have rejected the Messiah, and the wild branches are the Gentiles who have now been grafted on, right? And what Paul is saying here is, don't boast and be like, ha ha ha, you guys are off the tree, right? No, you should be grateful that you're on the tree, right? Okay. If you do boast, remember that it is not you that supports the root, but the root that supports you, right? Meaning your faith depends on what has come through Judaism, right? And to kind of boast in their face is to undermine yourself, right? Okay. You will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in, right? But they got the short end of the stick, literally, and I'm getting grafted on, right? That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast only through faith. So do not become proud, but stand in awe. Again, one of the ways that God is using the rejection of the Jews to bless the Gentiles is partly by negative example. Okay, don't fall into the same pride that they did. Is his point. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Right? If you make the same mistake as them, is God gonna keep you on the tree? No, right? You're gonna get cut off too. Okay, if you're proud and that all that stuff. Note that the kindness and the severity of God, severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided that you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. Again, I would say this is another verse that's kind of against the whole once saved, always saved, right? You need to persevere in God's kindness and not become proud that now I'm on this beautiful tree that really you can't take credit for. Okay. Same thing with us, by the way. Sometimes, especially for those who maybe grew up Catholic, cradle Catholics, it's like, oh, like, I know the true faith because I've always been Catholic. It's like, no, that was a gift, right? Nothing that you earned, right? I mean, be humble, right? That like, that you were born and that you were given that gift, right? It doesn't mean that doesn't mean that the Catholic faith is not the true faith, right? That's not what I'm saying. But it's just like, we shouldn't be hesitant. We shouldn't be quick to look down on those who don't know the truth, right? Even if we say that, yeah, we believe the church is the true church, right? Anyway. And even in the others, if they do not persist in their, well, it's okay. So, and again, this is where Paul is still, he hasn't given up on Israel. And even if the others, if they do not persist in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. So Paul hasn't given up on Israel. He's saying, these and actually there's a kind of tacit like teaching about resurrection here, right? The branches that have been cut off can come back because God has the power to do that, right? So he hasn't given up on them. For if you have been cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted back into their own olive tree? One of the things, and this is true today, right, that Jews who become Christians, they don't have to give up their Judaism, right? There's a nun who had what was her name? She had one of those Lighthouse CDs. Augustine, I can't remember her name, but she grew up Jewish, and she became a Catholic nun. And even using the word converted is a little bit kind of wrong wording because it's like, and she makes, I remember hearing a talk from, I don't remember her name, but like she talks about how by becoming Christian, particularly Catholic, she did not have to give up any of her Jewishness or her tradition, right? It was the fulfillment of everything that she grew up loving as a child, right? As opposed to like a pagan who worships Zeus and has a bunch of wives. It's like, yeah, you're gonna have to give some up, right? That's not compatible. But Christianity is the fulfillment of Judaism, right? So what's Paul's point here is that when they're grafted back on, the shoe fits, right? Or the branch fits, Okay. Why? Because it's the fulfillment, right? Okay. This is all. Okay, there we go. Okay, 25. Last little section here. Lest you be wise in your own conceits, I want you to understand this mystery, brethren. A hardening has come upon Israel until the full number of Gentiles comes in, and so all Israel will be saved. Now, this is where I want to. This is verses not exactly clear what Paul's saying here, but this is where I want to go back to. Remember in Hosea when Paul was talking about the Gentile or the people who are not my people are coming back in? One interpretation that I was reading about as far as what Paul is saying here that I think is fascinating, and it's kind of his solution to this whole Jew-Gentile thing, is the lost 10 tribes, because they were scattered and mixed in with the Gentiles. Paul is, because of Hosea and what he's saying here, he's kind of when he's talking about Gentiles, he's kind of also talking about these 10 tribes. Like, they are essentially Gentiles now. They're mixed in. They're indistinguishable. They're lost, right? They're no longer a people as insofar as the 10 tribes go. So part of what Paul's saying here, until the full number of Gentiles will come in, and so all Israel will be saved. Remember how I said, like, Paul's not just going for the little fish of saving the tribe of Judah. He wants the Messiah is going to save the big fish, which is all of Israel will be saved. Well, where are all these people now? They're all Gentiles now, essentially. So I think the kind of, I don't know, I think Paul's kind of clever solution is like, by going out and saving the Gentiles, we're saving, like the Messiah is saving the lost tribes and bringing back all of Israel, right? There's a kind of identity here of the 10 tribes with the Gentiles. And it also is in step with what God's whole plan was from the beginning. All peoples have been lost, okay? So it's kind of like, why is it that God's saving the Gentiles but not the people of Israel? By saving the Gentiles, God is saving the people of Israel who were lost because they're mixed in. They're indistinguishable, right? There is no distinction anymore between Israel, Jew and Greek in that sense, right? Yeah, does that make sense? It's subtle, right? And I had to I was reading about this, and it's like it's not, but I think it's there, right? That's what Paul is saying. That's part of what he's saying, okay? That it's not just a us versus them. It's like, no, the Gentiles includes the lost 10 tribes. And God's promise was to bring all of Israel back together, not just the Jews. Are you catching what I'm saying? Yeah, it's kind of, I think it's I think it's definitely there, right? And again, it was partly as I was reading about this, it was kind of like, oh, I didn't really myself had ever picked up on this, but Paul's kind of like I said, he's I think he's kind of breaking down that sharp distinction between Jew and Gentile, us and them, because it's like, no, by bringing in the Gentiles, he's bringing in all of Israel, and then that's going to bring back the Jews too, right? All of Israel will be. Notice he says all of Israel will be saved, because if it just is the tribe of Judah, that's not all of Israel, right? And again, I think Paul is saying, no, the Messiah is going for the big kahuna, right? Like, we're not just going for the little mediocre Jewish kingdom. We're going for all of Israel, okay? Yeah. So anyway, let's keep going. And so all of Israel will be saved. Here, that's what I want to say. In other words, all Israel comes to salvation by the Gentiles coming to salvation. It's a simultaneous event. It's not just an us and them. The ingathering of the Gentiles coincides with the regathering of the lost tribes. That's another way to say that, right? So when Jesus says, I've come for the lost sheep, right? Well, the lost sheep are now Gentiles, right? So it's like, it's not just, again, it's not just an us and them. I don't know. I find it kind of a brilliant, fascinating solution of Paul, right? And it kind of breaks down this sharp distinction between, well, remember the original context of the letter, we're the Jewish Roman Christians and we're the Gentile Roman. It's like God is gathering all of Israel, right? The lost tribes that were, if you want to even think about it as like happy fault, that the scattered tribes that were scattered out into the world, as they're being brought back in, so too are the Gentiles, and right, it's all like coming to fruition, right? God is using that evil of the scattering to now bring everybody back together, right? And I think that's why it caused, well, we'll see in a second. Okay. So, so that's part of what's going on in verse 26, all Israel will be saved. This is really where Paul has been leading this whole point, okay? Again, I know this is really dense, okay? But like this whole question of like, how does this fulfill God's promise to Israel? Paul is confident in God that God knows what he's doing and all Israel will be saved. It's all leading to that point. Now, what exactly does he mean by that point is a little bit perplexing. I think part of it, and two main lines of interpretation, okay, that aren't mutually exclusive, is St. Augustine and others say that all Israel is referring to the church, okay, which is true, I think. And then others have taken an interpretation that's more eschatological or towards the end times, that all Israel refers to a mass conversion of Jews at the end of time. This is St. John Chrysostom, okay? Both can be true. Now, I do want to kind of warn against, like, I don't think we should spend too much time trying to, like, figure out how the Jews are going to be, like, the president of Israel decides he's Christian, right? Like, okay, maybe that's it, but it might not, right? Like we don't want to spend too much time, like, predicting how that's going to happen. And it maybe not, that may not happen, but those two lines of interpretation, kind of that more all Israel referring to the church, and then all Israel referring to some future mass conversion of Jews, right? They could both be true, okay? But we shouldn't spend too much time trying to, like, predict or look for that to happen, right? And lest we be deceived. Okay. All right. So then he quotes Isaiah here. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion and will banish ungodliness from Jacob. Notice he says Jacob, not just Judah. Okay. All the tribes. And this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. And yes, this can apply to Christ's second coming, but I think Paul is primarily talking about Christ's first coming, right? My covenant with them when I take away their sins. And who's them? All the tribes. Jesus' mission was to gather all the tribes and to take away their sins through the new covenant. This is the new covenant in my blood, right? We're used to that language at Mass, okay? All right, verse 28. As regards the gospel, they are enemies of God. In other words, they're opposed to God. But for your sake, and we're talking about those who have rejected Christ, but as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. For the gifts and the call of God are irrevocable. And God hasn't given up on Israel. Just as you were once disobedient to God, but now have received mercy because of their disobedience, so they have now been disobedient in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may receive mercy. So basically what's Paul saying here? Hey, if God can take you disobedient Gentiles and make you guys saved, he can also do that with the disobedient Jews who have rejected him. They too can be saved. So don't reject them out of hand or give up on them. Okay. For God has consigned all men to disobedience, that he may have mercy upon all. Again, not in the sense of God is crushing our free will, but he has let us go this route so that he might bring us back, right? Okay. And then I think that, like, this whole mystery and this whole kind of, like, again, we can, like, we can kind of grasp at it or, like, appreciate it from a certain sense, but to kind of let it overwhelm us of, like, our confidence in God and what he's doing to reconcile the peoples to him, it causes Paul, and I think it should us too, to go into this kind of prayer, exaltation, whatever you want to say, and it's beautiful. He says, "Oh, the depth of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments, and how inscrutable his ways! For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen." So again, I think Paul has this beautiful poetic exclamation about how great God is, because it's like God knows what he's doing, and he's known what he's been doing the whole time, right? That, again, like, something that would look really bad to us, the scattering of the lost tribes, God's actually using that to bring all peoples back to himself, right? Or, like all these kind of things. And I think it just kind of, like, overwhelms Paul, and he goes into this, like, how great God is. Like, I would have never thought of it, right? And Paul was a guy who, for first part of his life, thought he had it figured out, right? And it's like, no, it's much greater than I can imagine. I think, and we'll end on this note. I guess to wrap it up, right? 9-11. God is fulfilling his promises to Israel. And there's many different ways that we can kind of look at it to grapple at this problem, but we shouldn't despair, right? As I think his, like, kind of main point at the end, right? That, like, we should have supreme confidence in God that he knows what he's doing, even if it's not always apparent to us, right? Again, if Elijah can miss the 7,000 who are still faithful, maybe we can miss a thing or two that God's doing around us, right? And it causes Paul to be, like, very hopeful for his own people that he cares about, right? And so it's not, the um yeah, Paul would say, if you ask the question, does the gospel fulfill God's promises to Israel? Absolutely, and then some, and we should be really confident in that. And I think the same thing today. We shouldn't be despairing because, like, maybe some of the things in the church aren't exactly the same as they were 50 years ago or 100 years ago. Like, okay, God knows what he's doing. Okay, our job is to be faithful and have confidence in him. Okay, so yeah, there's a lot there. Like I said, it's really tense. But that kind of, but hopefully you can see too how that it does fit into what he's been doing this whole time, which is to show like how God is saving the world through Christ. Okay, now what he's gonna shift into, for those of you who are more pragmatic, like, let's just get to the practical stuff, right? How do I live my life? That's what the rest of the letter is going to be about. Okay, it's like, okay, now you Roman Christians, what does all this mean for you? But again, I think that it's important to go, right, what we believe affects our behavior and vice versa. But like, and again, I think like that kind of beautiful exhortation of confidence in God's mysterious and wonderful ways that go far beyond how we could ever have figured it out. That's kind of the attitude or mentality to take.